I write to you. What more is needed? What else is there that I could say?
It's in your power. I've never given my heart to anyone on earth.
It has been foreordained in heaven.
Resolve my doubts, my way for you from birth.
Days and nights to wonder why an artless soul's imagining. I close. I tread through this through. I'm faint with shame and fear. However, I boldly put my trust in you, whose honor is my pledge forever.
He left me on red. Alexander Pushkin stands tall amongst all of Russian literature because before him there was practically nothing. If you've seen my episode on history of Russian literature, highly recommend, kind of proud of it, you'll know that Russian literature came to be rather late 18th century, but it was with Pushkin when it truly became real. Yes, there were odes of Lomonosov and Derzhavin, Zhukovsky was kind of good, but Pushkin stands a few heads taller than those guys, and he himself recognized this quite early on. In Eugene Onegin, the book that we're going to be talking about today, there is this verse. And with a smile my muse was greeted, our first success encouraged us, we were by old Derzhavin headed, and blessed before he joined the dust. And that refers to an early episode in Pushkin's life when Derzhavin, a renowned poet and politician at the time, came to the Lyceum where Pushkin was studying. The students were able to present to Derzhavin, and Pushkin read some of his own poetry to him. Legend has it that Derzhavin was quite impressed and wanted to meet the young prodigy, but Pushkin was kind of scared and stressed that he ran off somewhere and no one could find him. Another prominent author, Zhukovsky, a little later, 1820, when Pushkin published his first poem, Ruslan and Lyudmila, sent Pushkin his portrait with this inscription: to the victorious student from the defeated teacher on this honorable day when he finished Ruslan and Lyudmila. It was a tradition back then to send each other portraits as a sign of friendship, which is hella cute in my opinion. So yeah, the old generation, the first generation of Russian literature saw great potential in Pushkin very early on, and they were right. Alexander Pushkin was born 6th of June 1799 here in Moscow. The family line was a noble one. A famous ancestor for Pushkin was Abram Gannibal, a military chief, general-in-chief, I think, and a nobleman of African origin, by some estimations either Ethiopian or Cameroonian. He was kidnapped and enslaved as a child by the Ottoman Empire, but then was smuggled out of there and into Russia and presented to Peter the Great, who in turn freed him and raised him in the court as his own godson. That particular ancestor, Gannibal, fascinated Pushkin. He even dedicated an unfinished novel to him. He called it The Moor of Peter the Great. Pushkin's parents were not particularly good with money, nor did they pay too much attention to their children, so Alexander was first thrust into the arms of a peasant nanny and foreign governors until it was time to select the school for the boy. Thanks to his uncle, Alexander got into the prestigious Lyceum in Tsarskoye Selo near Catherine Palace. The education received there prepared students for the civil service, and Pushkin also found some lifelong friends there. But more importantly, he started writing poetry there. The Lycée was buzzing with all sorts of ideas. Political clubs were forming as well as the literature ones. Pushkin was quite welcome in the latter, but he had some trouble getting into the political ones. It was likely due to his reputation. Pushkin had an explosive temper and he had his way with words, obviously, so he could come up with a scathing comeback on the spot, which led not only to disagreements but even duels with his own friends even. Pushkin challenged 4 people to a duel, including his own uncle, before an actual duel took place. His friend Kühlbecker challenged him to a duel over some jokey poetry of Pushkin's. Over the course of his life, Pushkin challenged and was challenged to a duel about 30 times. Most of these conflicts were resolved peacefully, but there were also a number of duels that Pushkin participated in. There is a famous one with a man called Zubov, where Pushkin was standing melancholically eating cherries while waiting for Zubov to fire a shot. And there is also the very last duel, the fatal one with Dantes. This entire duel culture was a byproduct of the Napoleonic Wars, because bravery, honor, and a certain sang-froid in the face of danger were the qualities that were praised in the military officers that allowed them to win that war. But these same qualities were also expected from the noblemen in general, and in the peace times that mostly they could only be displayed in duels. But another thing that this war with France brought on is a certain unrest amongst the officers. The young nobility was looking at everything that was going on in France at the time and was thinking that Russia and Russian monarchy also needed to be revolutionized. Secret societies were forming all around the country. They were coming up with ideas on how to modernize Russia. They were drafting constitutions and coming up with ideas on how to restrict the absolute monarchy. And that made the Tsar Alexander I quite nervous, because he saw what revolution can mean to a monarch. And so Pushkin entered this type of society. He nominally started working for the Collegium of Foreign Affairs, but most of his time and efforts went into poetry. His first publications happened in Lyceum already, but his first big piece was the poem Ruslan and Ludmila, published 1820, a fairy tale-esque poem with elements of erotica. But that same year, 1820, Pushkin was arrested for the first time for writing epigrams on Arakcheev and Alexander I himself. He could have been sentenced to Siberia, but thanks to his friends, the punishment was replaced with a soft exile. And by soft, I mean that it was officially a work reassignment, but an exile nevertheless. Pushkin spent 4 years in Crimea and that southern part of the Russian Empire near Odessa and Kishinev. Quite a productive time for him. The poems The Prisoner of Caucasus and The Fountain of Bakhchisarai stem from that time period, and he also started working on Eugene Onegin there. 1824, he was fired from service and sent to his family estate in Mikhailovsk near Pskov under constant surveillance, nominally for entertaining atheist ideas. He spent 2 years in Mikhailovsk reading, writing, and visiting the neighbors. His friends were actually quite worried for him because he was quite sociable, so an exile like this, imprisonment like this, couldn't have been easy. He managed. One of his female obsessions, Anna Kern, used to live in the estate over Trigorska, so that probably helped him out a bit. Pushkin in general was quite amorous. There is a supposed Don Juan list of Pushkins with 30-plus names on it, so he was quite popular with women and became obsessed with women as well. But as far as the confinement, Pushkin probably understood what kind of danger he was really in. He was never officially a member of those secret societies that I've mentioned, but he had friends who were part of those societies. He simply never managed to get in. We can at least assume that he was sympathetic towards those ideas. Legend has it that Pushkin learned about the upcoming Decembrist revolt, December 1825, and he even tried to go to St. Petersburg, but on the road there, first a hare crossed his path, then he met a priest, both terrible omens, and so he turned the carriage around. Pushkin was quite superstitious. And honestly, it's a good thing he did, because otherwise he would have been on Senatskaya Square that day and probably would have been sent to Siberia, if not sentenced to death. So in Mikhailovsk now there is even a statue in honor of the hare that saved Pushkin's life. 1826, Pushkin was summoned to Moscow to meet the new emperor Nikolai I. As a result of that meeting, Pushkin's confinement was lifted, he was free to go, and Nikolai I even named himself as Pushkin's only censor. A great honor on paper, but in reality proved to be quite problematic. Nikolai I insisted that Pushkin run everything that he wrote by him through his general Benkendorf. And really, when the emperor is the only censor, there is nobody for you to appeal to. And on top of that, Pushkin remained under police surveillance until the very end of his life, so Nikolai never fully trusted him and believed him to be a terrible influence on the masses. During these late 1820s, Pushkin continued to write. He became fascinated with historical literature specifically. A famous poem from that time is Poltava. Pushkin became restless, though. He wanted to travel abroad specifically, but all requests to Nikolai I were denied. Pushkin's unauthorized trip to Tbilisi was met with a harsh reprimand and a threat from General Benkendorf, who served as a liaison between the poet and the Tsar. So Pushkin decided on another change. 1830, his proposal to an 18-year-old Natalia Goncharova was finally accepted. But Pushkin first needed to accumulate some funds because the bride didn't have a good enough dowry, so Pushkin was gonna lend some money to her family so that she appears as a worthy bride. Pushkin never even got that money back from the Goncharovs, actually. Pushkin's financial state has always been a little bit precarious. His parents didn't have much. He used to support his younger brother for a little bit, and on top of that, he was mostly trying to support himself via writing and publications. So in autumn 1830, Pushkin headed to a village called Boldina to take control over a neighboring village that his father gifted to him as a wedding present. And Pushkin got stuck in Boldina for 3 months due to a cholera outbreak in the region. This period, now called Boldina Autumn, it was probably the most productive for Pushkin, if deeply stressful on a personal level. He needed to get back to Moscow to get married. He probably was worried that Natalia marries another in his absence. And on top of that, the very real threat of death from cholera that couldn't have been easy. And yet, this is everything that he's written in 3 months in Boldina. It includes poems, fairy tales, short stories, and the final chapters of Eugene Onegin. This is also the first time that Pushkin tried his hand at prose, with quite a bit of success, really. The most famous prosaic pieces by him, called the Belkin Tales, are coming from Boldina. In December 1830, Pushkin returned to Moscow, and in February 31, he married Natalia Goncharova in Moscow. The couple had 4 children together. In this late period, Pushkin continued to try his hand at prose, for example, Dubrovsky, Captain's Daughter, or Queen of Spades, amongst others. Captain's Daughter is also a good example of Pushkin's interest in historical events, Pugachev's revolt in this particular case. Pushkin also wrote a number of fairy tales, the one I've certainly read as a child. But money was still tight. Pushkin now had a family to take care of. So upon the family's return to St. Petersburg, Pushkin started a magazine, the famous magazine Современник. And this gets us to the last sad part of the story. 1836, a man called Georges Dantes started paying very close attention to Natalia, Pushkin's wife. And the rumors started spreading around St. Petersburg. Around the same time, some of Pushkin's friends received an anonymous lampoon that hinted that Natalia was actually Nikolai I's favorite. Pushkin suspected that Dantes and his adopted father and lover, Baron von Heckeren, were behind the lampoon, and he challenged Dantes to a duel. Dantes avoided the duel by proposing to Natalia's sister Ekaterina and marrying her instead. But that didn't stop him from continuing paying attention to Natalia, which enraged Pushkin. Pushkin then sent a very offensive letter to Heckeren, knowing that it will likely result in a duel, but Heckeren was a foreign government official, so he couldn't participate in the duel, so Dantes went instead. January 27th, 1837, the duel between Dantes and Pushkin took place. Dantes shot first, mortally wounding Pushkin, who died 2 days later. Dantes was also injured, but survived. He lived to be 83 years old, and when later he was asked how could he kill such a great man as Pushkin, he said, "Am I not a great man myself?" Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh. No, I hear you, yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay, bye. Well, he didn't like my text. It's not me, it's him, and all of that. Yeah. Give me a sec. Pushkin studies take up a lot of literature studies in Russia. Pushkin is recognized as the best poet that Russia has ever known. I don't think any of our poets would have taken offense to that. Pushkin's contemporaries already saw him as somebody important. The day of his death was a day of great mourning. Mikhail Lermontov, our second best poet, became famous for his poem, Death of a Poet, that he wrote in memoriam of Pushkin. And every poet after that in general recognized the influence that Pushkin had on their work, just like Gogol had his influence on the prose writers. Pushkin's legacy in general is phenomenal. There are over 300 Pushkin monuments in Russia alone. I found this one in Rome as well. And there is also one specifically in Gannibal's homeland of Ethiopia. Pushkin comes into our lives very early on thanks to his fairy tales, which are very helpfully in verse, which is great for both children and parents. This is me at 7 or 8 years old performing in a school play that is based on one of Pushkin's fairy tales, which in turn is rooted in the same folktale that Snow White is, except in our story she does not have 7 gnomes but 7 hunky men, which obviously is better. I played the evil queen. This is me doing a variation of Mirror, Mirror on the Wall monologue from that story. My point here, beyond my vanity, is that we get indoctrinated into Pushkin very early on, and with good reason too. Pushkin's poetry is incredibly flowy. He wrote mostly using yamb, and that makes it very easy to learn his poems by heart, and he also used very regular everyday words. That was actually quite revolutionary for the time period. The nobility of the time spoke French as much, if not more, than Russian. Russian was for the peasants, and so nobility could barely write in Russian, preferring French. So Pushkin made it almost a task for himself to popularize Russian and actually create literature in that language. Russian literary language was rigorously structured thanks to Lomonosov, which was fine for a bit, but that system was not sustainable, as simple words such as rooftop luck or nonsense were not allowed to be used in literature as they were considered colloquial or vulgar. Pushkin, though, he started using these simple everyday words in his poetry, thus breaking barriers between the spoken word and the written word, and we're thankful to him. I cannot spend too much time in this video on how Pushkin revolutionized Russian language. The video is long enough as it is, but trust me on this, Russian language is the way that it is today in great part thanks to Pushkin. So this effect that Pushkin had on Russian language is one part of the Pushkin studies. Another one is studying his biography, even today, 200 plus years later. Who was this woman only listed by her initials in his Don Juan list? Were there actually orgies at the Lycée? Who were his muses? Was Pushkin actually part of those secret societies? Questions like these excite researchers to this day, the same researchers who cannot say with a straight face that Dantes and Baron von Heckeren were actually lovers, and when Baron brought him to Russia they needed to legalize their relationship in some way, so he adopted him, while Dantes had a very much living, breathing father already. So I would love to tell you all about the orgies that Pushkin participated in, but I can't fact-check that because all of the researchers are prudes and still try to protect Pushkin's honor even 200 years after his death. Spoil sports. And then there are studies of Pushkin's works. Pushkin wrote predominantly poetry, and poetry by the very nature of it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. This is why this video is so long, because no matter how many books I've read, how many lectures I've listened to, nobody can give me a straight answer as to what this book is actually about, so that's fun. I'll do my best to at least give you a framework of how to approach Eugene Onegin, and maybe my preferred reading of it, but hey-ho, this is literature. There are no wrong or right answers here. On to Eugene Onegin then. Eugene Onegin was written over the course of the decade. Pushkin himself estimated that it took him 7 years, 4 months and 17 days to complete. The novel was published chapter by chapter in periodicals until the final publication as a completed novel in 1833. The novel was a true sensation for the time. People were waiting anxiously for the next chapter, the same way that we now wait for the next season of a beloved TV show. The novel currently consists of 8 chapters. It was originally intended to be 10, but Pushkin burned the 10th chapter, and another one he also excluded from the canonical text. It is currently sometimes published as an addendum called Onegin's Travels. If your edition includes said chapter, you can read it, but keep in mind that Pushkin believed his story to be complete without it. On to the recap then. Quickest recap ever. The author-narrator introduces us, the reader, to his old friend Eugene Onegin, who's recently inherited an estate from a deceased uncle. In the first chapter, we observe Onegin's lifestyle as a single bachelor without a job in St. Petersburg. In the second one, Onegin relocates to the country. He is just as bored in the country as he was in St. Petersburg, that is until he meets his neighbor Vladimir Lensky and they become friends. Lensky is courting a girl called Olga, and so one day he drags Onegin along to meet the family. Olga's sister Tatiana is instantly taken by Onegin. She's read all of these romance novels, and she believes herself to be the heroine and Onegin to be the hero of said story. So she writes him a beautiful love letter, but Onegin rejects her. Onegin stops visiting them after that, until one day Lensky persuades him to go. The day before, Tatiana sees a dream that she believes to be prophetic, where Onegin is surrounded by demonic beasts and he claims her and then kills Lensky. On the day, which is Tatiana's Saint's Day, Onegin is moody and pissed at Lensky for dragging him along, so he decides to get back at his friend and steals all of the dances with Olga from Lensky. Lensky takes great offense to that, leaves the party, and on the next day sends his second Zaretsky to Onegin with the challenge that Onegin accepts. Lensky then visits Olga and understands that the whole affair was this great misunderstanding, but still is unwilling to back out from the duel, so at dawn he meets with Onegin and Onegin shoots him dead. Time passes, Onegin has left, Olga marries another, and Tatiana is restless. One day she wanders to Onegin's estate and the housekeeper lets her in to look around. Tatiana is fascinated by the books that Onegin has read. Trying to understand the man that she loves, she spends days reading these books until eventually she starts questioning him and who he actually is. Tatiana's mother, quite worried for her, decides to take her to Moscow to find her husband. 3 years pass, Onegin returns to St. Petersburg, and during one of the soirees he notices Tatiana. He barely recognizes her, she's changed so much, so statuesque and proper, and married to Onegin's old friend, Prince X. Onegin is taken by her. He starts following her around, paying her compliments and small acts of affection. He sends her letters, but all of this is met with indifference or sometimes fury. One day he goes to see her in private, and Tatiana confesses to him that she loves him still, but she is going to remain faithful to her husband. And this is where we leave Onegin, as if by thunderstruck. Let's first address the medium and translations. Pushkin called Eugene Onegin a novel in verse, although in his own correspondence he's interchangeably called it a poem. I'll address the novel in verse part a little bit later, but let's first talk about the verse component. Eugene Onegin is almost entirely written in Onegin stanza, a verse form that Pushkin invented. It is written in a sonnet. It's a 14-line stanza consisting of 3 sets of 4 lines called quatrains, and a closing couplet, a set of 2 lines. It is written in the iambic tetrameter with the rhyme scheme of AB, AB, CC, DD, E, F, F, E, G, G, where the lowercase letters represent the feminine rhymes and the uppercase letters represent the masculine ones. And that alone already presents quite a challenge for translators, a challenge that many of them took up. There are at least 20 plus translations of Eugene Onegin into English, some in verse, some in prose. I'll link below a page done by a gentleman called Stephen who compiled 13 versions of the first stanza of Eugene Onegin done by different translators, so you can compare them if you're curious. I have here a Charles Johnston one. This is the Penguin Classics over here. And this one, this is a dual edition done by Olivia Emmett and Svetlana Makurenkova. Neither is perfect, really. Some bits are better than the others. The one that I liked most, however, is the one done by Stanley Mitchell. I don't have a physical copy on the electronic one, unfortunately. I understand he spent about 7 years translating Eugene Onegin, about the same time that Pushkin spent writing it. I'm going to be using his translation for the quotes that I'm going to be using in this video, so if you want to read Eugene Onegin in verse, that's probably the translation that I recommend. I also have here, this is the French version, done by Nina Nasakina. Pretty good. I browsed through it. I quite enjoyed it. And I've also read, I looked through the German one done by Th.Commichau, I guess. It's pretty decent as well. If you don't care about the stanza and you really, really want to read a literal translation, thus one in prose, then you might as well pick up the one done by Vladimir Nabokov. He also spent a lot of time working on it, and he's also provided an extensive commentary. The irony of Nabokov translation is that I cannot read it. He's done a really good job of providing a literal translation, so when I read it, I see Pushkin's words, and they obviously sound better in Russian, at least because they rhyme. But also, speaking of Nabokov, since Eugene Onegin is such an object of fascination for researchers, there are a number of commentaries that were done for Eugene Onegin. Most famously, this one, done by Yuri Lotman, a Russian historian, and this one by Vladimir Nabokov, a Russian-American writer. This one is also written in English with a foreign audience in mind, so this is probably the one that you might have access to. I'm not sure if Lotman's work has been translated into English, actually. Look at the size difference, though. This is the commentary. This is bilingual version of Eugene Onegin, so it's twice the size as it should be. Come on. What would you need a commentary for, though? Eugene Onegin is a pretty good slice of life description of the nobility of the early 19th century in Russia. Our beloved critic Belinsky coined Eugene Onegin to be an encyclopedia of Russian life, but really it's an encyclopedia of the nobleman's life. One heck of a difference. Life of peasants is almost not covered in this book beyond their brief mention in chapter 5. Same for clergy and other big strata of society of that time period. They are only briefly mentioned at Onegin's uncle's funeral. So everything that you see in the novel is a representation of the life of nobility in the 19th century, first in the capital in St. Petersburg, then in the country, and also briefly in Moscow. Pushkin adds multitudes of details that are true markers of the epoch: wardrobe, customs, education, occupation, literature, and even specific individuals. This is where these endless commentaries come in, trying to explain these specific details to the audiences. So if you're interested, all the power to you. In the same vein, Onegin is full of literary allusions, references, citations, and sometimes almost plagiarisms. For example, the very first line of Eugene Onegin that everyone in the Russian-speaking world knows, "My uncle was a man of honor," is actually a callback to Ivan Krylov's fable, A Donkey and a Man, where the donkey was an animal of honor. And so it's almost a joke because the donkey in the fable was not very smart. But also, this entire thing about the dying uncle and Onegin going to see him all moody and broody, that's lifted straight from Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin, a novel that Pushkin loved, a novel that also starts with the protagonist going to see his dying uncle. And the novel is full of things like this, references and callbacks to the novels and books and poems that were all the rage during Pushkin's times, but become more or less obscure as the time went on. You might recognize the callback to Dante's Inferno, but I'm not sure if you've read Sterne or Richard Sonne. I certainly haven't. And so Onegin is not only the slice of life of the 19th century Russia, but also of all of the literature that existed at the time. If finding references like this is your king, no judgment here, pick up Nabokov's commentary. He dedicates a lot of this volume to such references. Maybe sometimes he goes a little bit overboard even. Nabokov believed that you need to understand the teensiest details to truly understand Eugene Onegin. That's why this book is so massive. Well, beyond Nabokov's ego, that is. But while I can appreciate the point he's trying to make here, I don't necessarily agree. Both Nabokov and Lotman make a good point that Pushkin's contemporaries had the advantage of understanding context and hints that Pushkin left without any need for this required reading monstrosities, just by the virtue of them living in that time period. A single word dropped by Pushkin was enough to provide context to his intended audience, and now it requires 3 pages of explanations. So in theory, in order for you to understand the book the way that Pushkin wanted, you need to read these pages. However, these wonderful historians are very bad at differentiating between details that are necessary to understand the plot and those that add flavor to the piece. You might not know what samovar is exactly, but it's brought up in a context of Lenski having tea at Larin's, so you can make an educated guess that it's some sort of teapot. A detail like this does not affect your understanding of the novel, even if you get it slightly wrong. This is normally how I have approached reading texts in foreign languages. If you encounter a word that you don't know but can guess it from context, you do not need to look it up, unless you really want to. If the word that you do not know is affecting your understanding of the text, then you need to look it up. And this is how I tend to approach these anachronistic texts. I do not need to look up what baguette is only to find out that it's a clock brand. So while Nabokov and Lotman will give you paragraphs on paragraphs about samovars and bolivars, I want to draw your attention to a few details that you might not know on the historical context that might help you understand the novel a little bit better. First of all, Tatiana's letter. For the time period, Tatiana does an incredibly stupid and risky thing in sending the letter. Unmarried women were not supposed to have any correspondence without their mother's supervision, especially with strange men, and especially confessing love to said strange man. When at the end she says, "My life is in your hands," she's being almost literal. If the existence of the letter or its contents became known, Tatiana would have been ruined. Just like in those Regency dramas where an unmarried girl cannot be alone in a room with a gentleman, the same type of thing, ruined. Tatiana is simply overtaken by the romance novels that she's read, and she imagines herself as such heroine, disregarding rules and decorum. And ironically, Onegin is behaving pretty decently. He keeps this letter in secret and tells her off, even if he's being a little bit harsh and self-righteous in that moment. Second of all, Tatiana's dream. It lends itself to interpretation. There are a few floating out there, including one that compares beasts in Tatiana's dream to Decembrists. It's wild. But here I want to draw your attention to the folklore roots of it. The dream comes to Tatiana as a result of Yule divination. She wanted to see her future. Specifically, she wanted to see her future husband. But such divinations are also tied to the world of evil spirits, the supernatural, the demonic. In such a dream world, funeral rituals are often mirrored with the marriage rituals, and thus the groom is often a dead man, or at least a demonic creature. And thus, in Tatiana's dream, Onegin's image is tied to this demonic being and the Byronic hero that she's already made him up to be in her head. But to be fair, the demonic groom is often romanticized in folklore as well. You should have guessed by now that Tatiana's dream is a premonition of the marriage. Both crossing of the river and the bear are both omens of a marriage, but even what happens in the hut, it is a marriage ceremony if a bastardized one. Things happen in the opposite order. Onegin is the demonic groom who takes Tatiana to the marital bed. Lotman also notes that in some folks' tales there is a trope of the groom killing the bride's brother, and that could explain Lenski's death in the dream beyond the prophetic nature of it. A little bit later, Tatiana calls Lenski her brother. Third, the duel. An often asked question is, why did Onegin kill Lenski? A question with no easy answer. First of all, let's consider the historical context and the duels in the Russian Empire. Duels were forbidden in Russia as people were viewed as property of the Tsar, so it was only he who could make decisions about life and death. The punishment for duels was death, but in true Russian fashion, the strictness of Russian laws is mitigated by the non-binding nature of their enforcement, at least for the rich and powerful. So the capital punishment was almost never used. Most noblemen got off with a demotion or a couple of months in prison. Onegin seemingly gets off scot-free. And so the duels were happening quite often. Pushkin himself participated in a number of them. The main driving force behind the duels was bravery that looks more like bravado, and the concept of honor and defending said honor. Bravado feeds a little bit into the performative nature of duels, the rituals of it, the no backing away in the face of a pistol, but honor is everything. A nobleman held on to the right of defending said honor like a lifeline. Since the duels were forbidden, there was no official guidebook as to how the duels were supposed to be performed. The noblemen relied on the knowledgeable people in Onegin, that's Lenski's second Zaretsky, who were tasked with kind of making sure that the unwritten protocols were followed. Normally, the conditions of the duel were defined by the nature of the offense caused. They varied from almost theatrical duels where neither party is really interested in harming the other to the death ones. That's the one that Onegin and Lenski end up having. The offense that Onegin caused Lenski was legitimate to an extent. Dancing multiple times in a row with a lady was a sign of interest in said lady, but still Lenski overreacted. That's fully admitted in the text, so why didn't he back out? Their fate is sealed as soon as Lenski chooses Zaretsky as his second, a man who knows a lot about the duels, and he seemingly does everything in his power to make this duel as gruesome and scandalous as he possibly can. It was his duty to try and resolve the conflict without it ever getting to guns, but he never offers that option to Onegin, who probably would have agreed. Eugene's immediate reaction to this demand for satisfaction was swift enough, discussion spared. He said he'd always be prepared. Zaretsky rose without explaining, not wishing to prolong his stay. For household business, claimed his day, he left forthwith. But that's not the only instance where the rules are broken. Zaretsky could have and should have called off the entire duel when Onegin was as late as he was. Zaretsky should have met with Onegin's second the day before, which never happened. The seconds were supposed to be from the same class, and Onegin brings his lackey. Then Onegin speaks directly to Lenski, another breach. All of this breaks the code, the dueling code, and yet Zaretsky lets it all slide so the duel can happen. But as you can see, Zaretsky is not the only one who breaks the rules. Onegin does as well, but seemingly with a different intent, and that is not to let the duel happen. Being late, bringing in second who cannot be second, he seemingly hopes until the very end that the duel does not happen, but he cannot offer to resolve it peacefully. Only the offended party can, and Zaretsky never does. Even during the duel, Onegin cannot shoot into the air. That would have been even a greater offense to Lenski. And really, the way the rule that this duel was set up, if neither party is harmed, then they start the duel over until one of them falls. So it's literally Onegin's honor versus his life. But even still, even in the way that Onegin shoots, he still tries to spare Lenski. So the way that it works, they stand a number of paces away from one another. They turn around and they start walking towards one another up until, I want to say 10 paces between them. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But they basically can start shooting from at any point. So if you wanted to kill your opponent, you shoot from as close as possible to one another. If you don't want to shoot to kill, but want to shoot to harm, you shoot from further away. So Onegin shoots as they walk towards one another, so it gives him a lesser chance of actually getting Lenski, and yet. Lotman concludes that Onegin, who seemingly never cared about the rules of society, was bored of them, falls victim to his own pride, his honor, and other people's opinion of him. Too late now, everything is settled. Now this old duelist has meddled in the affair. What's left to do? He's vicious and a gossip too. The answer to his droll dominion should be contempt, or worse, but then the whispers, lusts of stupid men. And there it is.
Public opinion, our idol, honor's spring which wound, ensures our universe goes round.
Lotman uses the phrase sacrificial offering for honor, and I think that describes the whole situation quite nicely. Lenski is sacrificed to save Onegin's honor. By the way, there is also circumstantial evidence that points to Lenski's death being reported as suicide, because his grave is outside of church's courtyard, as is custom for suicide victims, and Onegin also doesn't face any consequences beyond the guilty conscience, that is. And number 4, because it's somehow a point of contention. I think it's Nabokov who started it, or at least it's in his commentary, and it's the question of whether or not Tatiana gives herself to Onegin in the end. For whatever reason, a portion of the audience, Nabokov included, does not trust Tatiana's words, and isn't that worrying when she says, "But I am someone else's wife. To him I shall be true for life." Nabokov does not trust Tatiana or Pushkin, doubting that they're telling the truth. He somehow reads Tatiana's monologue as passionate or even aroused, and that somehow opens the door to considering that she might have or will give herself to Onegin, and that leaves me confused. If anything, this is the best proof that your interpretation of any text reveals more about you than the text itself or the author. Side note, Alexander Minkin in his book calls out Nabokov quite nicely, because he also noticed this weirdness of interpretation of Tatiana's character by Nabokov. And Nabokov also, a few pages earlier, tries to understand what Tatiana means when she says that she used to be better. And Nabokov concludes that obviously her age has played a factor, as it has ruined the smoothness of her skin and features at her very old age of 21. Not all of us are obsessed with Nymphet-Mr. Nabokov. 21 wasn't that old even in Pushkin's times. But back to but I'm someone else's wife, to him I shall be true for life, so we can put this whole situation to bed. Consider this, what is Onegin's game here? What is he after? He's pursuing a married woman, he tries to talk to her, touch her, pays her compliments, visits her, and all of this is compromising her, even if nothing is going on between them. Onegin is not subtle. Look at his letter through the eyes of Tatiana's husband, if he were to read it by some happenstance. Onegin makes it seem that his affections are not only welcome but returned. Even if he succeeded and she gave herself to him, it's only an affair, not some grand love story. Look at Anna Karenina. And Tatiana is angry with Onegin. She does not enjoy his affections, as they are putting her in danger. But moreover, there is reason to believe that Onegin is not in love with her on some spiritual or emotional level. He's simply lusting after her. His entire letter is very horny by 19th century standard, hugging knees and all that. So he wants a sexual relationship, but not necessarily a romantic one, and we know from the first chapter that he gets bored of such affairs quite easily. So the only real outcome for Tatiana here is an affair that stands to ruin her and her reputation, but not give her what she really wants, a love match. But even if we set Onegin and his intentions aside and look at Tatiana and her words, I'm going to talk about Pushkin's transformation over the course of him writing Eugene Onegin a little bit later, but consider where Pushkin is when he writes chapter 8. He's stuck in Boldino wanting to get married. He's no longer a young bachelor pursuing married women, he is a soon-to-be husband, and so this faithfulness and honor of married women becomes also important. To illustrate this point, look at other stories written in Boldino at the same time, things like The Blizzard, Captain's Daughter, or Dubrovsky. All of them have the same motif of faithfulness, even if it's preventing you from being truly happy. I'm gonna spoil the ending of Dubrovsky now, fair warning, sorry, but it ends literally the same way that Eugene Onegin does. Dubrovsky is late to save his beloved Maria, and she marries that count that she despises. So when he offers her to run away with him, she refuses because she now belongs to another. So this motif of importance of marriage unions, as they are granted by the higher power greater than us mortals, is very much present in Lev Pushkin's works. So I have no reason to doubt Tatiana and her words and her moral compass. So no, there was nothing going on between her and Onegin. And now, having said all that, should we finally talk about the book? So, as you can see, I've done my research, I've read books, I've listened to lectures, and this is not even scratching the surface. Still hit the like button because this is a lot. The problem, however, is that I'm no way closer to telling you what this book is actually about, and at least not confidently. When you start researching Eugene Onegin, the first takeaway that you stumble into is that the book is really not about the plot. The plot is incredibly simple. Girl loves boy, boy doesn't, then boy loves girl, but it is too late, and there is also a duel in the middle. There is no unique twist. All researchers point to the derivative nature of the plot, how it's lifted from the stories that came before. In general, there are, 5 plot lines in all of literature, so yeah, that's fine. But what is it then? Is it characters? Eugene Onegin, as a character type, is a variation of the Byronic hero. Lord Byron was incredibly important to Pushkin. I think he learned English specifically so he could read Byron in original. And so if you are familiar with the type, you should recognize some of these traits in Onegin. Proud, moody, cynical, with defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge and yet capable of deep and strong affection. Quite a few, yeah. Haughtiness, performative boredom. Onegin even gets powers with women from Don Juan. Onegin is a person without a past, without a face. We're only given the description of his wardrobe and hairstyle. We don't know anything about his parents or his family beyond the dead uncle. So everything that Onegin is a mask. I personally don't find this character type to be particularly engaging, specifically because there's little sustenance to them. It's all fake. That's the realization that Tatiana stumbles into when she reads Onegin's books, that he simply regurgitates other talking points to sound smart or interesting, but he himself does not process the information. He does not have any interesting opinions of his own. So while Onegin as a character accumulates a lot of the traits that were popular in the Western literature at the time, and also a lot of Pushkin's less appealing traits, one could make an argument that Onegin is not the protagonist of the story. Could it be Tatiana? Tatiana is much more dear to the author's heart. He cares for her, he worries about her, which contrasts nicely with Onegin, for whom he carries much less regard. We're given much more backstory into who Tatiana is, her family, her lifestyle, the books that she's read. She also gets a few Pushkin's traits, for example, his superstitiousness, and he also gave her the nanny that is likely created in the image of Pushkin's own beloved nanny, Arina Rodionovna. Look at the contrast here. Onegin does not have a family, he's estranged from them, just like Pushkin was. But the only person that Pushkin was close to in his childhood, he gives her to Tatiana, not to Onegin. Also, in contrast to Onegin, the books and customs that Tatiana grew up with inform who she is as a person, for good or for bad, really. Onegin wears the latest fashionable haircuts and the latest popular books as a mask. Tatiana lives by the rules of her books. This is why she is so instantly taken by Onegin. She imagines herself and him as the heroes of her love stories. And Onegin becomes her hero not by the virtue of who he is, but simply because he fits the bill of the romantic hero. And that is why his rejection hurts so much, because he is not behaving in the way that her romantic hero should. He should have whisked her away, preferably to the altar, or ruined her with an affair if he were more demonic. Onegin does neither. He acts honorably, even though for him it's another mask, another image. He basks in this role of being an honorable man in the situation, when in reality, I mean, come on, you've done the barest minimum here, dude. You no need to throw yourself a parade. As far as Tatiana's characterization, the only thing that's missing is her transformation from the naive young girl in the countryside to the solid princess in the capital. It all happens off screen. I could see the authentic nature of Tatiana being appealing and attractive, although I'm not sure that this trait would be particularly welcome in the halls of St. Petersburg. Her resolve, though, that's totally fair. Her remaining faithful to her husband, I totally believe that, no notes. But bringing this all together, I do not think that this is a love story between two people who were separated by fate or poor timing. I don't think it would have worked out between them anyways. If you look at the love story in Eugene Onegin, there is nothing unique here. Pushkin isn't breaking any new ground here. So what's the deal? Why is it so important, and why does it captivate the minds of readers and researchers to this day? Some of it comes back to the point that I've made in the very beginning. Russian literature was in its infant stages when Pushkin wrote Eugene Onegin, and that allowed for a level of freedom and experimentation. Pushkin called it a novel in verse, but look at the definitions of the novel. Does Eugene Onegin really fit it? Not really. There is the inverse component that we need to look at, but also keep in mind that there was not a single novel in Russian literature up to that point. Literature was dominated by odes, poems, fables, short stories even, but a novel hasn't been attempted successfully yet. The first successful prosaic novel is Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, written from 1835 to 42, and that's way after Eugene Onegin was published. And Gogol even cheekily labeled his novel as a poem in prose, an obvious callback to Eugene Onegin. Arguably, the deep philosophical/psychological novels that the Russian literature is really famous for would only start with Turgenev years later. So Pushkin was trying to start the novel tradition, simply in the medium that he was more comfortable in. Pushkin at the time was still more comfortable in poetry. Had he lived a longer life, maybe he would have found his voice in prose as well, but that's the what-if territory. But let's look at what the inverse component allows Pushkin to do in Eugene Onegin. When you read Eugene Onegin, you instantly notice that the author often gets sidetracked into areas that have nothing to do with the plot. Such digressions are not uncommon in literature. They are normally used to provide the reader with additional information that's going to help him understand the plot. But would you say that a digression like this helps you understand what's going on between Onegin and Tatiana? No. And that's because the third main character of Eugene Onegin is the author-narrator, if not the first. In these books, you will interchangeably see researchers call him Pushkin and author-narrator, highlighting the very thin line that differentiates the real person Pushkin from the character that tells the story within the text. And that comes back to the poetic nature of Eugene Onegin. In poetry, the author gets to explore feelings and experiences in the first person, and even though we understand that it is a character, he still kind of expresses the feelings of the author. In literature studies, it's called lyrical subject, lyrical speaker, or lyrical I. It is a character that is not necessarily equal to the author, although oftentimes it is. And we are introduced to such lyrical I in the author-narrator pretty early on in the second stanza, when he in turn introduces Onegin to us. Let me acquaint you with this fellow, the hero of my novel Prey, without preamble or delay. My friend Onegin has begotten by the Neva, where maybe you originated, reader, too, or where your luster's not forgotten. I liked to stroll there formerly, but now the north's unsafe for me. And from this point on, the author-narrator constantly interjects with anecdotes from his life, his feelings, opinions, or ideas. Even here in the second stanza, the line, "The North's unsafe for me," is autobiographical. The first chapter of Eugene Onegin was written during the South exile for Pushkin, and so the North, meaning St. Petersburg, is quite dangerous for him, because the Tsar banished him. Unsafe is probably not the best translation here either, by the way. It probably should be not good for me, because it's a play on words. Folks normally went south to improve their health from the harsh conditions of the north, and for Pushkin it's political. And at times it feels like Eugene Onegin has more digressions than the actual plot. Poetry, by the very nature of it, does not require much structure to it, unlike a traditional novel, and Pushkin leans into it in Eugene Onegin quite a bit. He would spend multiple stanzas in a row describing something from his own life and then go, "Oh yeah, Onegin," and tell us something about Eugene Onegin. At times, Pushkin masterfully weaves in these digressions, relating his personal experiences to whatever his characters are going through, and other times he simply tells us what he wants to talk about, returning to Onegin later. There is a strong case here to treat this book as a book about Pushkin, not Onegin and Tatiana. I personally like the reading from this book by Alexander Minkin, called Mute Onegin. He proposes that we treat Eugene Onegin as Pushkin's memoirs. Eugene Onegin was written over the course of the decade, so you can actually see the transformation that Pushkin goes through the years. Chapter 1 is a good description of his life in St. Petersburg, with Onegin kind of reflecting Pushkin's own experiences as a young bachelor there. Chapter 2, With a Life in the Countryside, is pretty decent representation of Pushkin's exile in Mikhailovsk, where he spent most of his times reading, writing, running after peasant girls, and going to see his neighbors, who also had daughters. When Tatiana goes to Moscow, we almost instantly switch into Pushkin's POV, and he describes Moscow the way that he remembers it from his childhood. So we get to see Pushkin at different stages of his life, and we are privy to his reflections on it. He sprinkles in personal details and anecdotes, like, for example, the famous passages about women's feet, like, for example, this one. Researchers identify specific pairs of feet and their owners, but I don't think that matters really. At times like this, it almost feels like a diary entry that Pushkin has decided to share with us. And that's a diary that spans 10 years. Pushkin didn't live to see 40, so it's a good chunk of his life, formative years, some would say. So you can actually see this transformation that Pushkin goes through if you're simply willing to look. The most obvious transformation happens in the way that the author views Onegin. Onegin, this Byronic hero, the superfluous man, the man that it is empty in spirit and alone. This character type might have appealed to Pushkin early on in his life, this man who, disburdened of the world's opinions, like him disdaining vanity, at that time we became companions. I liked his personality. The dreams to which he was addicted, the oddness not to be depicted, the sharp, chill mind and gloomy bent that revelled my embitterment. We both had known the play of passions, by life we both had been oppressed. In each the heart had lost its zest, each waited for the machinations of men and blind Fortuna's gaze, blighting the morning of our days. The same Onegin, whose defining characteristic is boredom and disdain, who lacks purpose or talent, a man who's meant for nothing. No, soon a coldness numbed his feeling, the social hubbub left him bored, the fair sex ceased to be appealing, to dominate his every thought. Betrayals no more entertained him, while friends and friendships simply pained him, since he, not always, it was plain, could drink a bottle of champagne, to down a Strasbourg pie and beefsteaks, and scatter caustic words of wit, while thinking that his head might split, and he a fairy rake his leave takes of this exhilarating life of sabre, lead, and martial strife. Such character normally appeals early in life when his persona is viewed as a protest, as defiance, but further you get into the life, the more you see the wastefulness of his character, and the less you are willing to tolerate it. The simplest example of transformation of Pushkin's ideals and where they actually separate from Onegin's is their treatment of women. In the first chapter, the author-narrator describes Onegin's conquests, how easy seduction was for him, how he'd mastered the art, seducing the wife one night and having drinks with the husband the next. He appears this Don Juan type, even if he's bored of it all already. This description of Onegin is a self-report by Pushkin. He also went after married women while remaining friends with the husbands. He also had a Don Juan list of 30-plus names that the historians salivate over. He was quite popular with women as well. But in Eugene Onegin, he gives this warning. Respected husbands, may I offer my service to you lest you suffer? I beg you, note my every word. I want you always on your guard. And you, mammas, pay more attention, observe your daughter's etiquette, and keep a hold of your lorgnette, or else you'll need God's intervention. I'm only writing this to show that I've stopped sinning long ago. And now look at what happens in the last chapter. Pushkin, who's writing the chapter, is about to marry the Belle of St. Petersburg in Moscow, a woman who's been rumored later to be the favorite of Nikolai I. Pushkin values and praises Tatiana for her faithfulness and honor, while Onegin hasn't changed that much. He uses the same seduction techniques on Tatiana that he used on women in chapter 1. He is going after a married woman for a sexual affair while she is married to his old friend, mind you. Pushkin wants her to stay faithful because he is playing a different role now, not the bachelor, but the husband. Pushkin has changed, Onegin has not. Coincidentally, that's probably why we leave Onegin here. In this mischance, in this unhappy circumstance, we leave my hero to his mating, for long, forever. The story of Onegin ends abruptly because there is nowhere for this character to go. He has no future. Pushkin once shared similarities with Onegin, but he is also the first to distance himself from his character. Pushkin has one advantage over Onegin, and that's his talent. Onegin has no purpose, no ambition. Pushkin himself calls him out for it when he says that he tried to teach him poetry but failed. Pushkin, though, he's looking for meaning and soon finds an avenue. He wants to be remembered. He wants his life to have meant something. He wants to leave a legacy. And for him, that's his work. Perhaps some future ignoramus, a flattering hope, when I am famous, will point to my illustrious portrait and say, now that man was poet. And so the novel Eugene Onegin becomes this work that accumulates everything that Pushkin was over the course of the decade that it took him to write the story. All joys or woes, the memories, emotions, women's feet, and Moscow cupolas. This is the monument that Pushkin's created that outlived him, that allowed him space and eternity, so now, 200 years later, we still read his words. In a strange way, Pushkin is still in a conversation with his reader to this day, with us, revealing bits and pieces about himself while telling a very simple story. Pushkin has this poem called Monument, where he spells it out for us. He wants to be remembered for his work. I will not wholly die. The soul, in a sacred lyre, will outlive my dust and will escape decay. And on this moonlit sphere my glory will not tire, as long as poets shall remain. So if you choose to read or reread Eugene Onegin now, look at what Pushkin is trying to tell you. Pay attention to those digressions and what Pushkin is trying to reveal to you about his soul. Because for me, after all of this, what I love about Eugene Onegin is Alexander Pushkin. And they say romance is dead. I write to you. What more is needed? What else is there that I could say? It's in your power, I conceded, to punish my naivety. But even if you've slightly pitied the dismal lot that I endure, you won't abandon me, I'm sure. At first I did not want to vex you. Believe me, you'd have never known the shame I've suffered all alone. Had I been hopeful to expect you here in our home where we could speak, if only seldom, once a week, enough to listen to your greeting and say a word to you, and then for days and nights to wonder when I could enjoy another meeting. Doch heißt ihr Stolz vertrüge nicht, in niederen Hütten einzukehren, und wir sind klein, gering und schlecht, nur dankbar einen Gast zu ehren. Ach, warum kamen sie aufs Land, wo wir so still verborgen waren? Ich hätte niemals sie gekannt und nie so Herzeleid erfahren. Ich hätte, klüger mit den Jahren, vielleicht ein anderes Ziel erstrebt und einem anderen Treu verbunden, ein friedlich Glück bei ihm gefunden und frommer Mutterpflicht gelebt. Un autre, non, jamais personne n'aura mon cœur, n'aura ma foi. C'est de là-haut que nous ordonne, c'était écrit, je suis à toi. De ma vie n'était qu'un gage de l'union de nos destins. N'est pas Dieu que le présage, tu es mon guide, mon soutien. Longtemps tu m'as hanté en rêve, tu m'étais cher, même inconnu. Ton clair regard m'avait ému, et dans mon cœur, ta voix sans trêve coulait. Non, je n'ai pas rêvé. Quand je t'ai vu, à l'instant même, je me suis dit, tremblante et blême, c'est lui. Enfin, je l'ai trouvé. Mais quoi, aux heures solitaires, ne m'as-tu pas déjà parlé, lorsque j'ouvrais mon aumônière, ou bien calmé par la prière l'angoisse de mon cœur troublé? И в это самое мгновение не ты ли, милое видение, в прозрачной темноте мелькнул, приникнул тихо к изголовью? Не ты ли с отрадой и любовью слова надежды мне шепнул? Es-tu mon ange protecteur ou un perfide séducteur? Ach, wenn nun Träume nur mich nahren, mein töricht Herz vergeblich weint. Perhaps my feelings are misguided, an earthly soul's imagining. Но так и быть, судьбу мою отныне я тебе вручаю. Перед тобою слезы лью, твои защиты умоляю. Вообрази, я здесь одна, никто меня не понимает, рассудок мой изнемогает, и молча гибнуть я должна. Я жду тебя, единым взором надежды сердца оживи, или сон тяжелый перерви, увы, заслуженным укором.
Кончаю. Страшно перечесть. Стыдом и страхом замираю, но мне порукой ваша честь, и смело ей себя вверяю.